Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to a discussion about double-edged sword albums. This is part two. There was a part one to this and I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to get caught up and check out that first. But bands and musicians are always looking to make it big. And if they were once big, they're usually trying to get back up and have that same success again. And that can result in a number of different things, from member changes to reinventing their sound and a lot more. But with that success often comes a double-edged sword from which the band is later defined going forward. So join me as we run through 10 more albums as part of this double-edged sword album discussion that we're having here. As I said, this is part two. There is a part one. You can check the link for the description. Before we get started though, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this, with a very cool episode on double-edged sword albums. All right, so the last one we did letters A through J. We're going to pick up with K and run all the way through Z as part of this one. First one being Kiss, Dynasty. 1979 is the year of release. It was the 7th studio album. And this one here had the band merging their hard rock sound with the predominant sounds at the time, disco. And you know, for that, it helped them have one of the biggest hits of their career. At that time, it was the second highest charting single for them, I Was Made for Loving You, after the song Beth off of Destroyer. And so ultimately, with that success, having a big hit, the album itself would go platinum, so it would continue the band's successes and so forth. It was one of those things that ultimately alienated a lot of their longtime fans who really wanted to hear the more traditional hard rock sounds of Kiss, not the newer sounds that ultimately were the disco and the things that were going on from the earlier days. And it began that sort of downward trend for Kiss, where the fans are really calling for them to return to that hard rock sound, yet they would fumble for a number of years more before they would ultimately make it back around 1982 and 83. All right, next one up, Metallica, the Black Album, 1991, 5th studio album. This one has sold 16 million copies just in the US, becoming the largest selling metal album of all time. And while the band has had much success after this, this band is still huge today, so there's certainly nothing about them not having success and so forth. The thing is, there's no denying that fans were fractured over this album here, and ultimately creating a thing where the fans would look at the pre-Black Album and the post-Black Album, and it would become that thing that the band is now constantly held to. You like the stuff they did before this, the more pure thrash, or you like this stuff, the more radio-friendly thrash that they did, and the stuff that came after it. But everyone kind of sees this as that, so it has become a very defining moment within their career, for which no matter whether they put out a new album that harkens back to earlier era thrash or whatnot, people cannot not mention the Black Album. And again, creating that double-edged sword for the band. Next one up, Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA, 1984, 7th studio album from the Boss. While the sound wasn't any real great change from what he had been doing prior to this, the album became such a big success, ultimately going on to sell 17 million copies, that fans cried out, sell out, so forth. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. It happened with a previous band we were discussing, Metallica. And, band is still the band, or artist is still the artist, so I never really quite understand that term, sell out. But ultimately it did, where people began to feel that the stuff was too commercial. And even Bruce barely to this day plays any of the hits off of this live. And in a way, this album has become a double-edged sword, not only for Bruce, for which the fans want to hear all the stuff from, but for the fans too. It was a very successful album that now gets little airtime when Bruce is out playing live. You never know if he's going to play one of these, he's not going to play one of these. So really, double-edged sword on both sides of the fence. Next one, Twisted Sister, Stay Hungry, 1984, third studio album, and while not a stylistic change in sound for the band from their two previous ones, it did feature their two biggest hits, We're Not Gonna Take It and I Wanna Rock. And with that, scores of new fans, I mean just droves and droves of new fans came out of the woodwork, including a lot of kids. And the band suggests that that may have a lot to do with the music videos and stuff like that that were a little tongue-in-cheek. And as Dee Snider, the frontman, has described, a little Wile E. Coyote type thing where they're showing people get hurt but not really get hurt in those videos and that sort of stuff, so a little bit silly in that regard. Bringing in the kids seemed to be the thing that ultimately made the image of the band less manic or, I don't know, fearful or whatever, that was supposed to be a tough image, ultimately became a little silly and kiddish in regard, ultimately leading to hurting the band, and something the band couldn't live down for the rest of their career was the imagery and idea of what this album was and so forth. The thing is, the album would sell 3 million copies and be their most successful album and had those two biggest hits on it and so forth, so they got the success they wanted, but at the same time, that success, I believe, is also what brought the band down, ultimately having them break up only 2 albums later. Next one, U2 Achtung Baby from 1991, 7th studio album from the band, featuring a huge shift stylistically from the sort of standard alternative rock, new wave rock, that they had come up with, into a mixture of electronic dance, industrial, and rock music. The thing is, the gamble paid off hugely for the band. Usually bands make that much of a stylistic change and it doesn't work, but there are a few bands out there that it has. And this new fresh approach to the 90s era sound really created some mega hits for the band. Ultimately, the album would go on to sell 8 million copies. But like with most things, not all fans, were happy. They wanted that earlier era, more straight-ahead alternative rock sound, and this didn't provide it. And the band itself would continue to go down this rabbit hole of that electronic dance sound, going deeper and deeper on the next 2 releases, losing fans along the way, losing album sales along the way, until ultimately making more of a traditional alternative rock return, as they did in the early 2000s. Next one, Van Halen 5150 from 1986, the 7th studio album from the band. First to feature new vocalist Sammy Hagar from Montrose. And like with any band that changes its members, there's always a certain amount of fans that can't accept it. But along with the vocalist change, they also made a shift with synthesizer and keyboard sound becoming very predominant on the album itself, and that immediately created 2 different distinct camps of fans, within the band, where you had the Roth era and the Hagar era, both being very successful. 5150 would go on to sell 6 million copies in the US, but, fans began to call for Roth to return to the band, and ultimately he did, but it brought with it a load of troubles, and then Hagar would return to the band, and vice versa, and so forth. And we know the rest of the history of the band, but they both were successful enough that at different times, fans called for different eras of the band, and the band had to go and do that in order to stay on top of things. Next up, Warrant, Cherry Pie from 1990, 2nd studio album. And again, while not a stylistically different shift from their first album, both of them very similar in fact, the album featured the massive hit, the title track Cherry Pie on it, firmly rooting the band in the glam metal sound of the era, helping it to sell 2 million copies. So of course, getting the success, and that's what the band was. So there's certainly no shame in being part of the glam metal movement, but the band really wanted to move on with their next album, Dog Eat Dog, in 1992, and no one was really interested in that. They were looking for the song Cherry Pie, something very similar to that, and that is not what the new album sounded like. Now, of course, grunge certainly had something to do with the lack of success on that new album anyway. But for the rest of the career, the band, was certainly being dogged by the song Cherry Pie, wanting to hear that or wanting to have hits that were like that and so forth, which ultimately would contribute to the downfall of frontman Jani Lane, his downward spiral that ultimately led to his death, and a very sad thing in and of that the double-edged sword of success that gave him this great album and so forth ultimately is the thing that he didn't like and didn't want to be tied to, and led to his downward spiral. Next one up, Whitesnake, self-titled 1987 album, sometimes also referred to as simply 1987, seventh studio album. This one here really completed the transition from just a straight-ahead blues hard rock band to the more predominant pop metal and glam metal sounds of the day. Became massively successful for the band, their largest selling album going on to sell 8 million copies, but would also become the gold standard by which the band would be judged going forward. And while most fans do prefer this sound, the one from 1987, there are those diehards that would prefer the more traditional blues hard rock sounds that they missed out on, instead of the polished sounds from 1987. Next one up, yes, 90125 from 1983, their 11th studio album, featuring a significant lineup change that brought with it a renewed interest in the band, also going and doing what a lot of other bands were doing in this era, which was the shortening of their more progressive style sounding songs into a more poppier, radio-friendly style. Ultimately, it featured the #1 Billboard Hot 100 hit, Owner of a Lonely Heart, their highest charting single, and their most successful album, going on to sell 3 million copies. But like with most change, the old fans of the progressive rock 70s weren't very happy with that new poppy style, and it really divided fans amongst that, creating a big catch-22 album for them here, where it's their most successful stuff, they have to play it, but it's also the thing that a lot of older fans were not interested in. And now you've really got two eras of the fans of the band. You've got 70s era and you've got 80s into the 90s era of fans for the band. All right, and the final one we're talking about here, ZZ Top, Eliminator, 1983, 8th studio album, featuring the final transition of the band's classic blues rock sound into the more modernized new wave synth style rock sounds that this album helped kick off for the remainder of the 80s. And while it did feature mega hits on here that you can't deny, and the album itself going on to sell 10 million copies in the US alone, the traditional rock fans that had come up with ZZ Top were really not that interested in this sort of a thing. But that needn't matter, because like some of these other albums we've talked about here, this album itself brought in droves and droves of new fans on it, and that lasted all through the rest of the 80s in keeping that going. And again, like most of these bands, there were two distinct eras of it. You've got the classic 70s sounding stuff that they did revert to towards the late 90s and into the 2000s and stuff, but you've got that 80s synthesized sound that lots of fans like myself grew up with and still love, and wish we could hear on new albums and stuff going forward. Again, creating a double-edged sword for the band. And there you go, 10 more double-edged sword albums as part of episode 2. There was a first part to this, and again, you can check that out with a link in the description and get all caught up on it. We've now covered through both of these episodes all the way through A through Z, and here 20 different albums that did that for bands. Certainly let me know your thoughts. I'm sure there are other bands out there and albums that you feel did the same sort of thing, and we can have that discussion as well. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.